Welcome back to Monitors Unboxed. One of the favorite videos that I make on this channel is the video at the end of the year where I rank all of the monitors that I've tested in that year. It's a lot of fun. I love putting that video together. And so I thought, you know what? I want to make more ranking videos. And that is starting today with this ranking video looking at 1440p OLED monitors. And so I was thinking, you know what, in those videos at the end of the year, it's only covering monitors from that specific year, but that's not all monitors that are available for people to buy. It's not all the relevant products. We don't go back and rank monitors that are still available in those lists, and that is something that a lot of you guys have been requesting. So I thought, you know what, let's do a ranking video where we can look at monitors across a wider period of time, but all within one category. So hopefully you guys enjoy this one where we're looking at all the 1440p OLEDs that I've tested, which I think is 29 different monitors. So as always, here's the tier list that we're working with. Of course, S tier is the best, F tier is the worst. All the monitors are over here ready to be slotted in. There's several pages of them, so this could take a little while to get through. As is the case with previous tier list videos, this is not meant to be a recommendation guide or a review of each product. We've got plenty of that type of content on the channel, so go check out all the dedicated reviews of the displays. I think 90+% of the products we're talking about today have dedicated reviews. So yeah, this is just purely about ranking each monitor based on its performance, features, typical cost over its lifespan, that sort of thing. And of course, I'll be usually focusing on the US market when it comes to pricing. But really with this video, it is ranking products based on their overall quality. What makes this one different to some of the previous videos that we've done is that when we looked at, say, all the monitors at the end of the year, that's just the products released in that year. So we can place some focus on value, I guess. And a lot of the comparisons that we're talking about are between products that are currently available, currently priced into the market. With this video, we're starting off with monitors released, I believe, at the start of 2023, some of which have been discontinued. So there is going to be more of a focus on the features and performance of the product based on how it would be going right now in the year 2026. So the products from 2023 may not be getting the highest rankings. That doesn't necessarily mean that there were bad monitors that were not worth buying at the time. It just means that based on all of the technology that we have available to us now, all of the other products that have been released since then, how does everything stack up? Has things been improving? And how would I rank those products from a few years ago compared to things released today? So just keep that in mind. There will be, of course, a discussion a little bit about value of some of those older products as well. But yes, this is a bit of a different focus given that we are going back a few more years. So let's get started with the very first monitor that we'll be ranking today, and this is the LG 27GR95QE, which was the first 27-inch 1440p 240Hz OLED monitor to be released. This was, of course, using first-generation WOLED technology. Now, I did test a couple of other ones, as you'll see on the side here, like the PG27AQDM, but I believe that the 27GR95QE is probably the second best that I tested to use this panel. Back in the day, this did have decent SDR brightness. HDR brightness wasn't amazing. I think, though, these days, the brightness that this panel produces is fairly low by modern standards. I believe it only went up to about 200 nits of full screen brightness in SDR content, and HDR brightness topped out only at around 700 nits on these models, which is low compared to some of the 1440p QD-OLEDs that we're seeing today. However, of course, being an OLED, it had the usual excellent performance, black quality, motion performance, all the things that we hadn't gotten in 1440p panels prior to this point. With the original WOLED panels that we got, they did have poor text quality. This was due to the use of a weird RWBG subpixel format, which was a bit unconventional. It did also use a matte screen coating, which was relatively heavy at the time. However, it does support hardware calibration, at least this particular model. And some of those original WOLEDs also had some dark gray uniformity issues, probably not as bad as we're seeing from today's tandem WOLEDs, but certainly from the start, uniformity was a problem compared to QD-OLEDs that would come later. So at the time, this was quite a good monitor and probably would have featured in the A tier. I'm not 100% sure where I ranked it in that year. You'd have to go back and have a look at that video. But I think these days, in terms of its performance, this is probably, it could even be a D tier monitor just based on the pricing. It was quite expensive at the time. I believe it debuted around $1,000 US, and it did quickly become a bit cheaper, but still quite an expensive monitor. And it did get discounted over time, and there were some follow-up monitors as well that used this same panel from LG. But generally speaking, these days, it's probably not a product that I would recommend people buy. I think if you're going to go for a 1440p 240Hz OLED, you should probably go for a QD-OLED as opposed to these first generation WOLED models. So I'll leave it in the D tier for now, which may sound a little bit harsh, but we'll check the rankings of some of the other options that are coming up in the next little bit. The next monitor that I'll be looking at is the Asus ROG Swift OLED PG27AQDM. So this was probably the best of the WOLED first generation monitors that I tested. It had the highest HDR and SDR brightness. It was about 35% brighter than the LG model in HDR scenes. It was also more expensive than a lot of the other WOLED options throughout its lifespan. I think it was probably the most expensive option throughout the first year or so of its life. And yeah, it presented itself as a high-end option for people and was a good quality monitor. But of course, it had all the same flaws as the LG option that we just talked about. So if we're talking about how would this go in 2026, for example, I think people that bought this are probably still keeping it and still using it, wouldn't have been incentivized too much to upgrade to a QD-OLED, for example, unless it was one of the higher refresh rate models. But I probably couldn't give it anything higher than a C tier just based on how it performs today. Again, brightness didn't get overly high. I believe for SDR content, it did get a little bit above 200 nits, which made it a bit more usable. But for HDR brightness, it still wasn't achieving 1,000 nits or above 1,000 nits like we see from some of the better quality panels that we get today. Obviously, text quality, things like that are not particularly amazing. So C tier, I think, is where that product would stand right now. Next up, we have the Corsair Xeneon 27QHD 240. So this is another 27-inch 1440p 240Hz WOLED. In fact, back in 2023, if you wanted a 1440p OLED monitor, you were getting this WOLED panel because QD-OLEDs weren't released until the following year. So this monitor had similar performance to the other WOLED options, but lower SDR and HDR brightness, especially compared to the Asus model. Underwhelming HDR accuracy, not sure how that went over time with firmware updates. I think Corsair did release some updates for this model, but it is one of the weaker options that I tested at the time, and I did not recommend it as highly as the LG or the Asus model. So I think this might even be an E-tier monitor, just because there were some issues with it at the time, and yeah, probably didn't stack up as well as these other models. It's not a fail of a product, didn't have huge overwhelming issues that would mean that you wouldn't purchase it, but especially compared to the monitors that are available today, I just wouldn't recommend this one at all compared to QD-OLEDs, as is something that I've talked about a little bit so far. Next up, we have the Acer Predator X27U, again, same 27-inch 1440p 240Hz WOLED panel. This one did get some improvements through firmware updates that we tested, and especially later in its product life, it did have quite an attractive price, being one of the cheaper models that was available. Again, not as good brightness as the Asus model, but certainly okay. There were some weird HDR switching issues that Acer claimed were intentional at the time. Not sure if they ever resolved that, but I didn't quite enjoy the way that that particular product acted switching between SDR and HDR, but its overall performance was okay, pretty similar to the LG model. So I think a lower D tier is probably where I'd be putting it for now. But of course, we can adjust these rankings later if things need to be changed. Another WOLED that we're talking about, and the last one of the ones that used this first generation panel that I looked at, was the AOC Agon Pro AG276QZD. So again, 27-inch 1440p 240Hz WOLED. There is the QZD2 model that is available on the market right now, though AOC switched to a QD-OLED for that version, so quite a bit different to this first generation option. Again, similar WOLED experience to the 4 that we've just been talking about. There were a few annoyances with this monitor, but it was very cheap, one of the cheapest options that you could get throughout the lifespan of WOLEDs. Not as bright as the Asus model again for HDR, though it did have good SDR brightness, hitting 250 nits, which was quite competitive. So I think this is a monitor that I would have recommended above some of the other options, at least in that original 2023 timeframe. But I just don't rate that WOLED panel especially highly in 2026. So, if I'm talking about this monitor, it's probably upper D tier, let's say. So I'd probably slot it in here, with the LG model being probably slightly worse just because it was a bit more expensive throughout its lifespan, whereas AOC really hit value with that particular model, which I think helped it a bit once those QD-OLEDs came into the market in the following year, which we can now talk about with the MSI MPG271QRX. This was a 27-inch 1440p 360Hz QD-OLED. This first QD-OLED panel at 1440p hit the market at the start of 2024, so a full year after the first WOLED models. But this brought with it a range of improvements. Of course, the higher refresh rate to 360 Hertz. There were some changes to things like text quality because of the triangle RGB subpixel layout as opposed to the weird RWBG layout that we got with WOLED. And some other things as well, glossy panel as opposed to matte, like all of these other options that we've just been talking about. But then there were some downsides with this first-gen QD-OLED panel that continue to today, such as its raised black levels and brighter ambient lighting, which again, we still see on 1440p models today. But overall, I would say this is quite a, good quality QD-OLED panel that I think a lot of people would be happy with, and it's still very competitive today. So if you are buying a 360 Hertz OLED monitor for gaming, the first-gen QD-OLEDs that we got here were certainly quite a good option. Now, I am referring to this as the first generation of 1440p QD-OLEDs because this was the first model released at a 2560 by 1440 resolution. But of course, other people do rank these things a bit differently. Some people claim that this is a third generation panel because we got two previous QD-OLED generations before this with the ultra-wide. So it just depends how you want to name all these different generations. I think of this as the first generation of 1440p panels, and it was available in a range of different refresh rates as well, not just 360 Hertz, but the 240 Hertz models and so on came a bit later. So if we're talking about this specific MSI model, again, great accuracy, great performance, fast. MSI offered it as well as at a pretty great price for a lot of its life. It wasn't one of the more expensive 360 Hertz models, though a lot of the 360 Hertz models debuted at a relatively high price. Better text clarity than the WOLED panels and better brightness for the most part. So they typically all achieve 250 nits in the SDR mode. A lot of these WOLEDs were stuck at sometimes 250 nits, but sometimes more down at 200 nits. Of course, QD-OLED panels can achieve 1,000 nits in some lower APL scenes. WOLED, at least at this time, struggled to hit above sort of that 800 to 900 nit range, and there were some models that were stuck more in the 700 nit range. So QD-OLED increased the brightness standards, though again, it did come with things like panel dimming that you didn't get on WOLED at the time. The glossy panel, again, a lot of people preferred that to matte that you could get on the WOLEDs. Better uniformity as well. So I think this is definitely, as far as monitors today, at the very least in the B tier, MSI did a great job of this specific model, no major flaws or downsides. Is it an A or S tier model by current standards? I think once you sort of think about tandem WOLEDs that we've got, the 500 Hertz, 540 Hertz options, and some of the cheaper 240 Hertz options as well, it doesn't elevate itself into those categories just because it's not it's not the best value monitor. These days, you can still find it for sometimes like $600, which is okay, but it's not the cheapest QD-OLED that would really entice you to buy it from that standpoint. And again, there are higher featured monitors that are available today with better things included in them, better performance. So I think considering all those things, the B tier does make the most sense. And then we got the Dell model, the Alienware AW2725DF, exact same panel as the 271QRX, so 27-inch 1440p 360 Hz QD-OLED, basically identical to the MSI in terms of its performance. It was slightly better calibrated, but had slightly fewer features, great pricing worldwide, which often made it a better value option than the MSI model, but it just depended on the sorts of feature sets and those things that you want. So certainly this would be another B tier model. I think it's very straightforward, basically the same as the MSI variant. And looking back on it now, I think a lot of people would have been really happy with that particular Alienware option from Dell. They did a great job of it. So yeah, we'll slot that into the B tier. And then we got one of the more interesting products that was released in 2024. This was the Asus ROG Strix OLED XG27AQDMG. So this was a 27-inch 1440p 240Hz WOLED. But unlike these 5 models that we ranked in the C, D, and E tiers, this model made some changes. So firstly, Asus implemented a glossy screen coating for the first time on one of these first generation WOLED panels. So this wasn't necessarily, I guess, an upgrade in WOLED tech, but they just switched over from using matte to using glossy. And this was the first generation of glossy, so not the true black that we get today. So it had this sort of slight haze in the coating that you don't get with the modern WOLED panels that are available today. But It did offer a glossy coating for people that didn't want the matte, and because it preserved black levels a lot better than QD-OLED, I felt that that glossy option was actually a really strong option for people that preferred the glossy coating and wanted to use it in a slightly wider range of environments than you would have been able to use a QD-OLED panel. It did have good HDR brightness at the time, no QD-OLED dimming issues available on this monitor either, good real scene results, but it didn't get quite as high in terms of brightness as some of those QD-OLEDs. It still wasn't really able to hit 1000 nits, though of course it depends on the sorts of scenes that you were testing there. Acceptable calibration, again, the subpixel structure was still a little weird. This was still an RWBG layout, no USB-C or KVM switch, but it also did have quite a competitive price when it was released, much more competitive with a lot of the QD-OLEDs, the 360Hz models that were available around this time. So a lot of the older ones, these models that we were sort of looking at down here, those were sort of up around the $800 to $1,000 range when they launched. The XG27 DMG, I believe, launched at around that sort of $600 to $700 price range, which again put it in direct comparison and direct competition with the QD-OLED. So this was a really good monitor that I think I recommended quite heavily at the time and was very competitive with these products. But then we also have to think of how would this be ranked in 2026? Is this a model that if it was available on store shelves, I'd be going out to people and recommending that you buy right now? I mean, if it was very cheap, potentially, but I think today when you've got the ultra cheap 240Hz QD-OLEDs available sort of in those low price ranges, $400, even $350 now, up to $500. And then you've got tandem WOLED and of course the higher refresh rate models available in all sorts of different price points. I don't think I'd be overly recommending this model just because of there are different alternatives available. So that would still keep it out of those upper two tiers, S and A tier that we're looking at here. But I guess it's a question of would this be a B or a C tier monitor today? I still think you'd be pretty happy with it. So maybe lower parts of the B tier is where it would belong. It'd be very interesting to go back and have a look at how I ranked all three of these models in 2024 compared to how I'm ranking them in 2026, because I think I might have had the Asus model above the QD-OLEDs. But yeah, it's interesting how things maybe go in hindsight and things like that. Maybe it's just because WOLED tech has advanced so much from that point that I'm now sort of thinking about these newer models that are available and how that stacks up to this first generation option. Whereas back then, of course, tandem WOLED didn't exist. So it was a bit more attractive compared to other models. Whereas the QD-OLED models are largely unchanged in a lot of ways from those first releases in 2024. So we'll keep going down through the list of some other options with the Gigabyte MO27Q3. So this is another 27-inch 1440p 360Hz QD-OLED, basically the same as the MSI and the Dell Alienware models. It did offer a boosted brightness HDR configuration, but there was nothing overly special about this particular product in terms of its features or its price. It was often more expensive than the MSI and Dell models while offering largely the same performance. So I guess I'd probably put that in the C tier just from that standpoint, but probably at the higher position in the C tier, a little bit ahead of the Asus PG27AQDM. So again, today, if I was recommending a monitor, I think it is discontinued at this point. Because it was an Aorus branded product, it was on the more expensive end. Gigabyte eventually switched over a lot of their OLED and QD-OLED lineup to the M series, which was a bit more affordable. So yeah, again, I think the price competitiveness of MSI and Dell throughout the years with their options gave them an edge over Gigabyte. Without Gigabyte doing anything else stand out that would make me recommend it, it's probably not a product that I'd be overly interested in telling people to go out and buy today. But again, same QD-OLED panel as all of those other options, so it still holds up relatively well. Next up, we do have quite an interesting monitor again here with the Asus ROG Swift OLED PG27AQDP. So this was a 27-inch 1440p 480Hz WOLED, and it wasn't just the higher refresh rate that you got with this model. This was also the second generation of 1440p WOLED technologies. They improved a few things here. They switched over to using the RGWB subpixel layout. So that changed and improved a lot of the text rendering issues that we saw with the first generation units. Of course, the higher refresh rate. It was generally better in terms of brightness than a lot of the first generation models as well. So it offered more in line with what you would have seen with the PG27AQDM, much more consistently in that range, sometimes even a bit higher than that model. So a lot of those issues where, occasionally you could just buy like an AOC or an LG and get lower brightness, that wasn't an issue. Buying the second generation panel, much more consistent performance there. Now, back in the day, this was an excellent monitor for competitive gaming, and it still remains an excellent monitor for competitive gaming today because of its high refresh rate of 480 Hz. It was also very flexible for other types of gaming, having both support for HDR and also variable refresh rates. So compared to some of those LCDs that were offering backlight strobing and that sort of thing, this is a much more versatile and usable monitor. Just plug and play, you could use it much more easily. Great HDR performance. It was bright, no panel dimming like you'd see from QD-OLEDs. At the time, it could have done with some EOTF tweaks just to tighten up its HDR performance, but Asus generally gave it great calibration. It did have a matte finish, so I guess in some senses that was a downgrade compared to the XG27A DMG that used the older generation of panel but switched over to that first generation glossy, but it was still fine for a lot of use cases. And it was still, at the time, typically brighter, though only slightly brighter than a lot of the QD-OLEDs that we saw at the time. So yeah, this is an interesting one to rank from a couple of standpoints of how I would see it today. So at the time that it was released, this was a very expensive monitor. It was over $1,000 US or around that sort of mark. So compared to, at least when it came out, those QD-OLEDs were sort of down around sort of $600, $700 price range. So to go from 360 Hz QD-OLED to 480 Hz WOLED, you had to spend a lot more money. So that sort of reduced the, I guess, high quality nature of this product because it was so expensive. And then relative to products today. So first of all, we do have newer generation WOLED tech at 540 Hz instead of 480 Hz. And that tandem WOLED tech is much better than even this second generation WOLED tech. So I think if I was recommending someone buying a high refresh rate OLED monitor today, I would recommend one of those newer WOLEDs. Then you've also got QD-OLED, which came out with 500 Hz that we'll be talking about soon. And that also offered higher brightness. It also offered, I guess, in some senses, depending on the model that you got, better value because they were cheaper than this Asus model. So that did, of course, hurt its value over time as well. And then, yeah, I mean, just its technology doesn't quite stack up to some of the products that we've got today. So overall, I mean, this is a difficult product to rank. It's still very good, but I think today, is this a product that I'd be going out and recommending people purchase today over some of the other models? Probably not. It has gotten cheaper in recent times. So does that impact things? I think I've seen it for like $600 or $700, but that does put it in competition with 500 Hz QD-OLED. So yeah, whether or not that's a good buy, I'm not 100% sure. I think these days I'd probably put this as a C-tier monitor just based on technology evolving. Is it as good as some of these models? I mean, I think it is better than the technology that we saw from these options. So probably high C-tier. Again, I'm sort of thinking this as if you wanted a 360 Hz QD-OLED, the 271QRX is a great choice, and I would still recommend it, still competitively priced. But if you wanted a 480 Hz WOLED, I'd probably recommend the newer models. So that's probably why I would see it fitting into the C tier, but it's not a bad product. It performs well, so it doesn't deserve some of these lower tier slots. Next up, we have got the Asus ROG Strix OLED XG27AC-DNG, 27-inch 1440p 360 Hz QD-OLED. So again, very similar to the MSI, Dell, and Gigabyte models that we talked about previously. It had a boosted brightness mode. This monitor, again, nothing special in terms of its pricing or features, very similar to the other models that we've seen. It wasn't awfully priced. It wasn't overly competitively priced, but it was still a good option for people. And I think these days, I think it is still available and it's not too poorly priced. So I'd probably put this in a B tier. I do prefer it over the Gigabyte model. I think it performs a little better than that one, but it's not, it's not crazily different or anything like that. But again, like, am I going to be preferring it over some of the better value 360 Hz models? Probably not. So I think it's a pretty safe B tier model for the moment here. Nothing extremely crazy to go over for this particular one. We've been talking about these 360 Hz QD-OLEDs for a little while now. And then we get to the MSI MAG271Q PXE2. So this is another QD-OLED, but instead offered a 240 Hz refresh rate. And this is the first model that I tested. I think I tested this in early 2025, but it came out in 2024. This was the first model that I tested that used this cut down refresh rate that was being offered at a cheaper price point. It turns out this panel offered basically the exact same performance as the 360 Hz models, which was great to see, but just at 240 Hz. So again, like pretty much exactly the same as the 271QRX. I think there was a few things that MSI didn't offer in terms of like port selection, a few small design tweaks, that sort of thing to also enable a cheaper price point. But essentially the same QD-OLED performance that you got from the 360Hz model, same brightness, same color performance, same sort of calibration, that sort of thing. Usual QD-OLED flaws in with it as well. Cutback USB ports. It was quite affordable at the time, certainly cheaper than if you wanted some of the 360Hz models. So I think from that sense, at the time, it was probably one of the better, I guess, QD-OLEDs. But then again, if I'm sort of thinking about value QD-OLEDs today, it's, at least at the time, it wasn't amazingly well priced. MSI did release another model that we'll be talking about soon that offered better value than this one. The E2 model wasn't as heavily discounted as some of those other options that came down to like $400 US. So I think from that sense, this is probably it's a C-tier monitor. Again, it's discontinued now. Would I recommend it for people if it was available on store shelves? Yes, at the right price. It's not as good as the 360Hz models, of course, because its refresh rate isn't as high, and its pricing over its lifespan when it was available was fine enough. So I think, again, this is probably a high C-tier product. I'm going to slot it in above the Gigabyte model, but probably below the 480Hz WOLED because that is a much better monitor overall. So I think this is probably where I'd have things sitting for this, or at least original bunch of monitors, the first 12 that we've looked at, but let's get into the second wave. So next up, we get to the MSI MAG27Q2 QD-OLED X50, 27-inch 1440p 500Hz QD-OLED. This was the first model that I looked at that used a 500Hz QD-OLED panel. So I would say this is using second generation 1440p QD-OLED technology. Again, some people would say that's a further generation, but this did provide some notable performance improvements compared to the first generation 240 and 360 Hz models. So it moved from the display HDR True Black 400 tier up to True Black 500. So that meant higher full screen SDR brightness up to around 300 nits or slightly above 300 nits. And it also meant higher brightness for some HDR content. It was still a 1000 nits monitor at sort of that top end peak brightness in the lower APL scenes. But in terms of overall brightness, especially for some of those brighter scenes, it did give you a small performance boost to, hit that True Black 500 tier. So there was that standpoint. So generally speaking, I found it to be about 18% brighter in HDR tests than the original 360Hz QD-OLED models. But of course, panel dimming was still an issue here as well. And same with a lot of the other issues with QD-OLED. So no changes to the subpixel structure, no real changes to the layer composition. So you still got that ambient light reflectivity, blacks appearing a bit gray or elevated in brighter environments. But again, 500 Hertz. So it did offer increased performance, increased levels of motion clarity, lower input lag, better responsiveness than the 360 Hz models. And one of the things I really liked about the MSI version specifically was its quite compelling price point. It was released for $750 US, which was pretty competitive at the time and even still today compared to some of the 360 Hz models and other QD-OLED variants. It was only a little bit more than the 360 Hz models to go 500 Hz, and you got better performance pretty much across the board. Still great calibration and tuning, that sort of thing. And I still feel today that if you want one of those really high refresh rate models, that the 272QPX50 is a great choice. It's one of the more accessible ways to access 500 Hz OLEDs today. So I think from that sense, this is probably an A-tier monitor, performance better than a lot of these other monitors that we've been looking at here. And it is a product, at least compared to some of the other ones I've been recommending, this is a product that I could say, yes, go out and buy a 272QPX50 because it is a great monitor and you'll be getting a good experience from it today. I still feel with the 500 Hz models that they're a little expensive still. I know that they do offer sort of that level of motion performance that for competitive gaming that you don't get with some of the other models, so maybe that can justify its higher price. But now that we've got QD-OLEDs regularly hitting sort of that $500 range, to spend an extra $250 to get 500 Hertz, which for a lot of gamers isn't overly necessary, especially if you're playing single player games. It feels like a lot, but it's not the worst price competitively when we're sort of comparing it to a lot of other options on the market. So another option that used this same 500 Hertz panel is the Samsung Odyssey OLED G60 SF. So again, very similar to the MSI model, but it did use a matte screen coating instead of glossies. This was Samsung's I guess, choice to go with matte to offer something a little bit differently. They were sort of justifying it by saying, well, for competitive gaming, those multiplayer fights and those sorts of things, you might not want distracting reflections in your screen. Fair enough. It's probably a bit better of an excuse than you would see from a 240Hz model. It did have, some interesting features, great SDR and HDR calibration, wide range of OSD settings, so you could change a lot of those things. But I wouldn't say it's overly feature-rich, so no USB-C, Dolby Vision, no DisplayPort 2.1. It's also very expensive, $1,000 MSRP. It has over time become more price competitive with the 272QPX50, making it a decent choice for people. I don't prefer it, though, over the MSI model. So I think, if you do want the matte coating, obviously a great choice. But outside of that, I'd tend to think the MSI model is offering you a little bit better at a little bit of a better price. So that's why I would go for the MSI model over the Samsung. But still a great monitor. I'd still recommend it for people today based on its, not being overly terribly priced even right now. And I do like the design of it as well. I think it's quite an attractive monitor from that sense. Next up, we have got the Dell Alienware AW2725D, a 27-inch 1440p 280Hz QD-OLEDs. This was another variant that we started to see being produced in 2025, the sort of third version of that first generation QD-OLED. So same panel technology as the 360 and 240Hz monitors, but now at a 280Hz refresh rate. So not quite sure why they released multiple different versions and variants like this, but 280Hz was also available at a decent price. Now, Dell calibrated this very well. Good premium design. There's no standout features here, just a typical QD-OLED offering at 280Hz. One of the real key standouts to this monitor was that it debuted at an excellent price, $550 US MSRP, and it's still available today for what I think is a really great price point. So again, yes, some QD-OLEDs are getting a bit cheaper, 240Hz models down below $500 US, but if you wanted a slightly better refresh rate, you wanted slightly more premium design and that sort of thing, the AW2725D offers that at what I feel is a great price. And it is still today cheaper, generally speaking, than a lot of the 360Hz models, while offering a refresh rate that is relatively competitive with that model. So yeah, a great value choice, I think, throughout a lot of its life, and is probably a monitor that I'd recommend strongly to a lot of people. Does it have that top tier performance that would make it competitive with some of the other options like the 500Hz models and that sort of thing? Probably not. I also don't think its price is sort of enough of a standout to make it a sort of A or S tier product today. It's not crazily cheap. You're not going to be rushing out to buy one. It's still just competitively priced. So I feel like that's sort of an upper A tier product. But yeah, a good monitor. I think a lot of people that bought one of those would be very happy with it. We do also have here the MSI MAG273QPX24. This is a very similar monitor to the 271QPX-E2, but it's sort of a newer generation. More basic design than the E2, so omitted things like USB-C, though there were some very similar X24 variants that existed with small changes to the design and that sort of thing. At the time, its price, it was released, I believe, at $600 US, which made it a bit underwhelming compared to the AW2725D, which debuted at $550 US. But occasionally, MSI put this model on sale, and you were able to get it for things like $450, which made it much more attractive, in my opinion, than the Dell model. So this was, for a lot of last year, quite an attractive budget QD-OLED monitor. And even today, if you can get it on sale, I think it is a great choice for people. Though MSI did recently tell me that this specific 273QPX24 has been discontinued and newer models are going to be released pretty soon. They might even be available on the market right now, but there's going to be some small tweaks, small changes to some of these models for 2026. So yeah, this was a good budget offering. Whether or not I'd rank it above that Alienware model or below, I guess it depends on how I'm thinking about the price over time. Yeah, it's probably sort of in this sort of range. Let's put it sort of towards the bottom of the B tier. I'm ranking the Dell above it just because of its better price at launch and better price throughout most of its life. With the MSI, you sort of did have to wait for it to go on sale. So from that sense, is that as attractive? Yeah, not quite sure. We also have here the Asus ROG Strix OLED XG27AQ WMG 27-inch 1440p 280Hz WOLED. This was using the new primary RGB tandem, now renamed to tandem WOLED panel, which was the third generation of WOLED technology that we saw used in a 27-inch 2560 by 1440 resolution. I feel, and I still feel to this day, that this is the best 1440p 280Hz-ish OLED that you can get right now. That's not to say it's flawless, and obviously it does have some challenges with things like dark gray banding, which a lot of people complain about with these particular monitors, but I feel like there's also a lot of strengths to the primary RGB tandem or tandem WOLED panel. It was bright, up to 330 nits SDR brightness, so compared to the 280, 360, and 240 Hz QD-OLEDs, much brighter for SDR content. It also hit up to 1400 nits peak in HDR content. Again, a lot of those QD-OLEDs and even the 500 Hz QD-OLEDs top out at just 1000 nits. So this meant that for a lot of HDR content, the tandem WOLEDs offer better brightness. And when you combine that with a lack of panel dimming, so panel dimming being one of the key issues that you get with QD-OLEDs, and what that meant is that in a lot of scenes, especially higher APL scenes, you get much better brightness out of these tandem WOLED panels, and overall brightness is also superior because it still has that high peak brightness in lower APL scenes. Asus calibrated this quite well. It had a strong feature set. And also with the tandem WOLED panel, we got a wider color gamut than some of the older WOLEDs, like we sort of talked about with those first generation models that I ended up putting into the D and E tiers. So from that sense, there was a lot of strengths going with this monitor. Asus also offered it with their True Black glossy coating, or just the glossy version of the LG display panel that was available. And that meant that you didn't get any of that ambient light reflectivity issue of QD-OLED. So in a lot of brighter ambient light environments, this gave you deeper blacks. It still does give you deeper blacks if you want to buy one of these monitors, because they are available, of course, right now. And I feel personally that the screen coating of these WOLEDs, the glossy version, is better than the glossy QD-OLED coating, though people do have differing thoughts on that because of the strong reflectivity of these panels. They have more of a mirror finish, whereas QD-OLEDs, they sort of mute to some degree the mirror reflections, make them less reflective, though of course you get the ambient light reflectivity, so it's a bit of a muchness. Now, some people feel like this monitor should probably be ranked in the F tier because of its dark gray banding issues, which some people feel is a deal breaker, but I sort of try and take, I guess, a balanced approach when I'm thinking about these WOLED monitors and how they compare to QD-OLED, because they do have that flaw. But QD-OLEDs also have flaws. As I've mentioned, the panel dimming that you get in brighter HDR scenes. You've also got the ambient light reflectivity. The subpixel structure is probably slightly weaker than you get with WOLED as well. This panel uses RGWB, which is quite a good layout, slightly better, as I said, than those triangle RGB layouts. So yeah, QD-OLED has flaws as well. It just depends on how you want to rank them. Do you prefer the better uniformity of a QD-OLED panel? No, dark gray banding issues, or do you prefer the higher brightness of WOLED, the better, the lack of panel dimming, the better screen coating, the better pixel density, the better subpixel layout, those sorts of things. And generally when I'm assessing and weighing up all of those things, I do prefer overall the performance of the G27M1Q WMG and the tandem WOLED monitors. That's not to say that they're flawless, and that's probably why I will not be putting it into the S tier. If this did not have dark gray banding issues, this would definitely be an S tier product without question. But I think for now, I'm just going to be putting it into the A tier. And whether it's a high A tier or a lower A tier, I feel like it probably does deserve sort of a high A tier position because it is one of the products that I would generally recommend people sort of, if you're after a premium 280 Hz-ish monitor to sort of encompass, the different refresh rate options that are available, I would be recommending this particular monitor. Again, though, by today's standards, in 2026, it is probably a little bit on the expensive side at $650 US. If you want 240 Hz QD-OLED, for example, you can save quite a bit of money compared to tandem WOLED. So that makes it a little bit less attractive than at the time that I reviewed it, I think, which was the middle of 2025, when some of those 240 Hz QD-OLEDs were a little bit more expensive, but they've become more price competitive. So that does weaken the value proposition of tandem WOLED a little bit. But I do think this is a great monitor. So for a lot of people that purchased one, especially if you did end up with a better monitor based on the sort of lottery that is associated with the dark gray banding issues, I think you'd be really happy with the performance of this particular product. So yeah, it's a great monitor, and hopefully we see LG Display able to solve some of those uniformity problems over time and make tandem WOLED an even stronger technology for people to use. Next up, let's blast through this one. This is the Gigabyte MO27Q2 1440p 240Hz QD-OLED, standard QD-OLED experience. Not as much HDR flexibility as previous Gigabyte models, which was a little bit disappointing, over brightening in the peak 1000 mode. Great design, fantastic sRGB mode. You get things like USB-C and a KVM switch. But for a lot of this product's life, it didn't have an overly competitive price. So if you were after a 240Hz model or something around that sort of refresh rate, I probably would have steered you more towards the AW2725D or maybe the 273QP-X24. So the MO27Q2, I think, is probably in this sort of range, middle of the C tier. Probably just from a technical standpoint, not quite as good as that WOLED 480Hz model, but a little bit better than probably the 271QPX-E2. It depends though. The 271QPX-E2 did come out a little bit cheaper. Yeah, I think I'll swap these two around. I think the MSI model was a little bit better priced at some periods of time. So I think that's probably fair. It is definitely better than the FO27Q3 in terms of pricing though. So I think that is probably a fair position. Next, we'll get to the MO27Q28G. So same tandem WOLED panel as the XG27AQWMG. It does use a matte coating instead of glossy, which was the major change. And it is slightly cheaper at $600 US compared to $650 US for the Asus model. Not as many features, but still more than past Gigabyte models. They added things like anti-flicker into this one, black frame insertion, great calibration. The sRGB mode in this monitor is great. And it has a great launch price as well. $600 US was quite competitive, more widely available than the Asus model. But again, QD-OLEDs are getting cheaper, so it's probably not as competitive as it was back then. It's also, in my opinion, not as good as the XG27AQWMG. So I think putting it sort of perhaps towards the lower part of the A tier makes sense. Still a monitor that I highly recommend for people who are after that sort of more premium experience from an OLED around this sort of refresh rate. Next, we have the Asus ROG Swift OLED PG27AQWP-W. So 27-inch 1440p 540Hz WOLED panel. So this is the exact same tandem WOLED technology that we were talking about with the XG27AQWMG, right down to the same glossy coating and everything like that, but just clocked higher in a sense. Goes up to 540Hz. It also has this unique dual mode that also runs it at 720Hz, but drops the resolution to 720p. So it's not the best mode. The resolution is quite cut back compared to the normal 1440p that you would get, but the motion clarity is unparalleled in that mode. So if you do have a game where you can sort of get away with the lower resolution, it might make sense, but in some games I found the UI elements to be pretty hard to read in the 720p mode. So the dual mode is fine, it's a nice feature addition, but I feel is really the key selling point of this monitor is simply its tandem WOLED technology at a high refresh rate. So previously when I was talking about the PG27AQ-DP being this 480Hz model that at the time was a great option for competitive gamers, the PG27AQ-WP is the option I'd recommend for people today. It's simply a better monitor in pretty much every way. It's got higher brightness. It's got, well, it actually has the same sub-pixel layout, but it offers you a glossy panel. It offers you some additional features that LG have put into it. So things like the proximity sensor, anti-flicker modes, and that sort of thing. Slightly higher refresh rate, wider color gamut. But it is a very expensive monitor. It is priced still to this day at $1,100 US, making it one of the most expensive options. But I think this is probably the best OLED 1440p model on the market as a whole. So I think that puts it into an automatic S tier for me. If there was sort of really high quality, great value choices, you'd probably see some of those coming into the S tier as well. But if you want the best overall product, I think this is better than the 500Hz QD-OLEDs in general. Of course, I'd probably actually recommend the QD-OLEDs to most people because of the lower price. But again, on a whole, looking at all of the features, performance, and everything, I feel like the PG27AQWP-W is the best 1440p OLED on the market. And Asus do a great job with their OLED, so great tuning and all that sort of thing. Next up, we have the LG 27GX700A. So this is a 27-inch 1440p 280Hz WOLED, same tandem WOLED technology as the Asus and Gigabyte models that we were talking about previously. There are some differences though. This is a matte panel, so same as the MO27Q28G, easily accessible ports and a decent design. but it doesn't have some of the features that I would have liked to see compared to the other more premium Asus and Gigabyte models. So there's no USB ports, there's no KVM switch, there's no high-level gaming features, there's no anti-flicker mode. You do get things like hardware calibration and unlocked color controls, which do improve the performance of this product. But I wasn't a huge fan of the black crush and calibration in the HDR mode, which do make it weaker than the MO27Q28G. It also doesn't have quite as strong OLED care options, really not very many options, and a weaker warranty from LG as well. So it has pretty much the same price these days as the MO27Q28G, but I think for most people, I would clearly recommend the Gigabyte model over the LG model at the same price. I just think the Gigabyte model is better. The LG model, not as good. The panel itself is still good, but it's just not a product that I would overly recommend to people compared to the Gigabyte model. So again, because it's still a good panel, I'd probably sort of put it into the C tier somewhere. I'd probably put it around here in the C tier. So yeah, I feel like that is fair. These are sort of monitors that I would have recommended to people at certain points based on pricing and performance. This is a model that, unless it suddenly got cheaper, is probably one that I wouldn't recommend, but still offers good performance if you did end up purchasing one for the most part, outside of some of those things that I talked about. So yeah, not too bad there from LG. Now we get to the Innocn GA27M1Q, a 27-inch 1440p 500Hz QD-OLED. So pretty much the same as the 272QPX50. Uses the glossy design, so not matte like the Samsung. White design, very similar in its overall aesthetic as the Samsung model, but sort of on the cheaper end, I would say. So the material quality isn't as good as the Samsung model, but still overall looks quite nice in my opinion. It has very good performance. So Innocn have done a great job of tuning this model to give you a very similar experience to what you'd see on the 272QPX50. But one of the things that really stopped me from recommending this when I did my 500Hz roundup was the fact that Innocn only offers a 1-year warranty and a 1-year burn-in warranty. So with MSI, you get the 3-year warranty that covers burn-in. With the Innocn, you only get a 1-year warranty. And while it is one of the cheaper 500Hz models, it's around $660 US these days. The MSI model is around $700 to $750 depending on the day. You're not saving all that much to get the Innocn while you're cutting back 2 years of warranty. And I think, you're really not going to get burn-in on these monitors within 1 year, but you may start to see it, especially if you use it heavily within 3 years. So I think for people that were after sort of this high-end premium 500Hz experience, noting that you are spending over $650 on this monitor, which is a lot to spend, I think you would want the peace of mind of the 3-year warranty. And that's why I just wouldn't recommend a lot of people purchase the Innocn model, which is unfortunate because it does perform well in a lot of other areas to performance. So if you did end up with this model, I think you'd be quite happy with its performance and features, but just that warranty, it's just not something that I would overly recommend to people. So I think perhaps towards the bottom of the C tier, does it against the D tier? I feel like, these models do perform notably worse than the G8. I mean, this is a 500Hz QD-OLED. It's a much better panel than the original 27-inch 1440p 240Hz WOLEDs. So I think I'd actually bump it up ahead of the PG27AQDM from that sense. It is like if you had the choice, both of these models were free, you could pick one or the other to use. I would pick the GA27M1Q over the PG27AQDM. It's a better monitor. So from that sense, it's, somewhere in the C tier, probably doesn't quite deserve D or E tier based on its performance. Next, we have the MSI MPG271QR QD-OLED X50. So this is a 500Hz QD-OLED like the 272QPX50, but it does have better features. So MSI added the AI care sensor to this model, so sort of similar to the Neo proximity sensor that you get with Asus models. DisplayPort 2.1 was added as well, additional USB-C power, and that came at a $100 additional cost compared to the 272QPX50. So today on the market, in terms of performance, this is a better model than the 272QPX50, which is a little confusing because it's 271 as opposed to 272 for the other model. So yeah, not the best naming scheme there, but it is the better model in my opinion. The problem though is that it is more expensive. So I think if I was going to someone, hey, you're interested in a 500Hz QD-OLED, which one to get? I personally would save the money and get the 272QP-X50 over the 271QR-X50, unless you specifically wanted some of the features that came with the higher-end MSI model. So this is still an A-tier monitor just from its performance, and I think I would probably slot it in above the MSI model, above this Samsung model as well. So I think I would slot it in above the Samsung model, but below the generally cheaper 272QP-X50. Next up, we have, again, another 500Hz QD-OLED, because I did a roundup and I decided to test a bunch of these. This is the same as the other 500Hz models. Very strong feature set. It did offer a unique feature being DisplayPort daisy chaining. It had DisplayPort 2.1 as well, ultra clear mode, anti-flicker, great performance, very similar to some of these other models. But it's not the most affordable option, and it also has limited availability. A lot of regions you can quite easily find the 272QP and even things like the G60SF, whereas the FO27Q5P is harder to find. It does perform very well, though, being one of the better options that are available in this 500Hz range. So if you did want premium features and premium performance, Gigabyte do offer it with this particular Aorus monitor. So I think this is still an A-tier monitor from that sense, one of the better panels that is available today. It has that second generation QD-OLED experience with higher brightness and so on, but just its pricing and availability probably makes it not as strong as some of the other options that are available. And now we get to the last batch of monitors, starting with the Gigabyte MO27Q28GR. Very simple one to rank here because this is the glossy version of the MO27Q28G. Performs basically the same as that model, and it's available at the same price of $600 US, but comes with the same glossy coating that you would see on the G27M1Q WMG. So generally speaking for people, because it is slightly better value, I would recommend the Gigabyte model over the Asus model. However, I still feel the Asus model is better because of a few additional features and a few additional performance things that the Asus model offers. But this is no doubt definitely one of the better monitors that you can get on the market in terms of 1440p OLEDs. So I think I would rank this higher up into here in terms of being above the 500Hz models, and is one of the monitors I'd recommend. That's simply because I personally prefer the glossy coating over the matte coating. So the non-ARM model gets, I guess, downranked a little bit compared to the ARM model. But yeah, I think both of these monitors being high A-tier monitors is appropriate to me. Again, if both of these had no dark gray uniformity issues, no banding issues, they would definitely be S-tier products. They offer the best performance in a lot of other areas for 1440p, 280Hz-ish panels and that sort of thing. But just that gray banding issue, the panel lottery, things like that make it a bit more difficult to recommend. But I still love the performance that is on offer for those models. And at least on my units, gray banding isn't a huge issue or concern, though. Yeah, I'll have to do a bit more research to see how widespread those things are. And then we get into the last couple of monitors. So we've got the Dell Alienware AW2726DM. This is a very interesting product because it uses a new variant of the 1440p 240Hz QD-OLED panel. So with some of the other monitors that we were talking about, so think 273QPX24, MO27Q2, these were just the 360Hz model, but downclocked to 240Hz. So same brightness, same experience, same True Black 400 certification, basically the exact same monitor, just at a lower refresh rate. With this AW2726DM, it has the same specs on paper in terms of being a 240Hz QD-OLED, but it is actually a different variant that potentially, I guess, Samsung Display have configured to not offer some of the additional brightness performance that you would see from the higher tier 240Hz models. So the key thing here is that brightness only goes up to 200 nits in the SDR mode instead of 250 nits with the 360, 280, and 240Hz models that we've been talking about. And it's also limited to just 400 nits in the HDR mode. There's no peak 1000 mode, and even the best HDR configurations don't get as bright as the true black modes that you would see across a lot of the other QD-OLEDs that we've been talking about. Dell also stripped out for this specific model some of the features that you would have seen on their higher tier products like the AW2725D. So there's no sRGB mode, limited ports, more basic design. And there's a few oddities with the HDR calibration depending on the metadata that's sent in. You can see more of that in my review. So yeah, it's a really interesting product because from a technical standpoint, this is not as good as the other QD-OLEDs. And it's quite clearly not as good because the HDR performance is nerfed without the peak 1000 mode. It's really as simple as that. But Dell are offering this monitor for just $350 US, which is much cheaper than you would see from a lot of those other 240Hz models, even when they go on sale. You know, I think we saw some sales down to around $400, which is sort of almost getting to the level of the AW2726DM, but this is a $350 model MSRP. So compared to the $500, $600 price points for some of the other options, it is much cheaper. So from that sense, it is a good monitor because it offers you a QD-OLED panel at a lower price. And there are a lot of strengths with QD-OLED that make it a better choice than LCDs that you would have previously seen in these sorts of price points. So previously, LCDs in this range, they were 240Hz, sometimes even 300 or 360Hz models, but because they're LCDs, they do have slower response times. So OLED gives you better motion clarity. You don't get as many of those motion artifacts using a QD-OLED panel because the performance is consistent across all refresh rates. You don't have to worry about overshoot and that sort of thing. You get lower input lag as a result. And then on top of that, much higher contrast than you would see from an IPS LCD that's typically in this price range. So if you are doing SDR or even HDR gaming, despite having not particularly impressive HDR brightness, you're getting a much better contrast experience, deeper blacks, better panel uniformity. It is a better panel for gaming than you would see from those LCDs, despite the brightness caps. So in this price range, it is also a good monitor. It's just not as technically impressive as you would see from some of the higher tier monitors in this tier list. So I think from that sense, I think it's probably is it a C tier or is it a B tier monitor? That's what I'm sort of thinking about. It does not have the performance, in my opinion, to be an A tier product. I think the lack of the HDR performance in terms of brightness restricts it from being A tier. It's just a matter of would I put it in the B or the C tier? And again, maybe I'll completely change my mind when I re-rank all these monitors at the end of 2026 when I do that big roundup. I think for now, though, it's probably a B tier monitor. The question is, do I put it ahead of the 360Hz models on the sense of it being better value but lower performance, or do I put it below the 360Hz models because it simply doesn't perform as well as them? So that's a really tricky one. I think to start with, would I put it above something like the XG27AQ DMG? The XG27AQ DMG is a better product, but it is a lot more expensive. It was at times twice the price of this Alienware model. Is it better than the XG27AC DNG? Again, no, in terms of its performance, that being a 360Hz model with better brightness. But the Alienware model is undeniably better value. So I think I would put it at the end of the B tier, if I'm being honest. I can't rank it on performance above these monitors, but then the C tier models, these were sort of selectively worth recommending. So PG27AQDP would recommend that at times for competitive gaming, but not all of the time. And those sorts of things, especially not today, you'd just buy the PG27AQWP over it. Whereas AW2726DM, I would recommend this today if you're interested in a $350 monitor. It is a great option in that price range. So I think bottom of the B tier makes sense. But again, I'll probably change my mind when I go through and re-rank these products at the end of the year. And finally, two monitors that I am yet to incorporate these results into reviews, but I am working on a 1440p 240Hz QD-OLED roundup, and I've begun testing some of these products. So I am including this in this roundup because I have fully tested it. So first off, we have the Asus ROG Strix OLED XG27AQD-MES. So 27-inch 1440p 240Hz QD-OLED, but this uses the same panel as the AW2726DM. So this is this new Samsung display lower brightness version. So 200 nits SDR, 400 nits HDR, no 1000 nit mode. What's interesting about this monitor is it has a much better feature set than the Dell monitor. So it's got an sRGB mode. It's got the Neo proximity sensor. It's got proper OLED care features. It's got better HDR calibration. It still has a basic port selection, but overall better feature set than you'd see from the Dell monitor. But the thing that really holds this monitor back, and is why I will not be recommending it and do not recommend it right now, is that its MSRP, I've been told, is $600 US. That is crazy because you can buy monitors like the MO27Q2, the 273QPX24, and monitors of that ilk, even the AW2725D, which is like still cheaper. That's a $550 monitor. This monitor from Asus is more expensive than those, but offers, I would say, mediocre, poor, not true HDR experience because it doesn't exceed 400 nits. So there's just no way that you would purchase this over the AW2725D. you would get that monitor every single time because it's brighter, it has better performance, it has a higher refresh rate. So this being $600 US is crazy. This should be in that $400 tier, below $400 to be price competitive with the Alienware model. So I think this is quite simply an E-tier monitor. There's just no way I can recommend it. I think the pricing is absolutely crazy and the performance doesn't hold up. Is it F-tier? It doesn't have broken performance. So if you purchased it, you'd still be getting a good experience that's in line with what you'd see from the AW2726DM. In fact, it is actually slightly brighter than the Dell model, but just its price tag is crazy. There's just no way that's justifiable. And then lastly, we have the AOC Q27G40ZDF. Again, exact same panel because we're starting to see these panels hit the market now. Exact same panel as the AW2726DM. And while it isn't available in the US just yet, in Australia, this is a very cheap monitor that is price competitive with the Dell model, if not slightly cheaper. So compared to the Dell model, it's pretty much the same monitor in terms of its performance. So brightness is very similar to the Dell model. It does have an sRGB mode and more OLED care options than the Dell option, but otherwise it is fairly basic. It does have decent HDR calibration, and as I said, it is cheap. But I guess one of the downsides is probably it does not have a height adjustable stand. The Dell model does. So that is quite a significant ergonomic downgrade. But other than that, it is broadly similar to the Dell model. So whether or not I would rank it in the B tier along with the Dell model or not quite in that tier, I'm not 100% sure. I feel like the lack of a height adjustable stand and it being a bit more basic makes it probably not quite as good as the Dell model, but it is still a product that I would recommend for people, again, with the understanding that it is one of these not true Black 400 certified monitors, 200 nits SDR, 400 nits HDR monitors. So I think from that standpoint, I'd probably put it sort of maybe middle of the C tier, sort of around here. Probably, again, not quite as good technically as some of these other monitors. But if you're talking about 271QPX-E2 that debuted at $600 US compared to the Q27G40ZDF that is sort of in that, at least what I'm hoping is going to be in the $350 to $400 price range US, it's a much more compelling option from that standpoint. So I think, yeah, somewhere in the C tier would make sense for that particular model, and that is all the monitors ranked. So let's see how the final rankings have shaken up. And as you can see, it is a mixture of sort of the lower performing panels, especially some of the older WOLEDs in the lower tiers, because I just wouldn't recommend them today based on the performance that they're offering. Then in sort of that C tier, we've got monitors that are selectively worth recommending and still are in some ways competitive with performance of products today. So, you know, those 240Hz QD-OLEDs and some of the other options are in there. Some of the not quite as good 500Hz models and so on are in the C tier. And then as we get up to the B tier, these are the models that I think are in some ways worth purchasing today, depending on the price and availability in your region. So things like the lower performing Alienware models, some of the 360Hz QD-OLEDs that are still quite good today, the AW2725D, of course, in there as well. And then the high tier models, these are sort of the better performing options, the cream of the crop technology that is available today, which I think are those 500Hz QD-OLED panels and the better versions of that, things like the 272QPX50. That is the best of the best 1440p QD-OLED tech on the market today. Of course, we do have the tandem WOLED monitors at 280Hz as well. Specifically, the glossy versions that I tend to prefer have gotten into the upper tiers. And then the S-tier monitor, the best of the best in my opinion at the moment, the PG27AQ WP-W, the tandem WOLED 540Hz model that offers the best performance across all categories in my opinion. So yeah, those rankings I feel are pretty suitable. I guess I don't think I'll be changing anything at the end of this video. Yeah, I feel like that's quite a good ranking. But what will be really interesting to see is, because I probably won't rewatch this video before doing the ranking at the end of 2026, but it'll be interesting to see how some of those monitors that I've tested throughout 2026 end up getting ranked in the video at the end of the year. So yeah, we'll see whether I stick with those rankings throughout the rest of this year and how that video will turn out. So yeah, stay tuned for that one. Anyway, for now, that's it for this video, really. If you're interested in looking at the reviews and the performance testing and benchmarks for all these videos or all these monitors that we've talked about throughout this video, we do have a lot of that content on Monitors Unboxed. I think pretty much all these monitors do have reviews in some way on this channel, so you can check those out for more in-depth thoughts on all of those monitors. Again, if for some reason you've used this ranking video as a recommendation guide for you and you want to purchase one of these monitors, we have links to that in the description as well. And down there, you'll also find links to our Patreon if you want to sign up and get access to some benefits like the calibrated settings that we provide for all of the monitors that we test, as well as our Discord chat, BTS content, and other good stuff. So yeah, it's been a long one, this video. As usual for the ranking videos, I think there was 29 monitors to get through in this one. But yeah, thanks for watching to the end. And I guess I'll see you in the next one.